Good afternoon. We're here this afternoon to present another interview related to person, places, and things in Cumberland County. We're going to share some stories and some historical facts from someone who has a wealth of knowledge about Johnstown. We especially want to thank the cooperation of the Life Center of Cumberland County here in Toledo, who they provided this facility to us so that we can do the filming, and we do appreciate their cooperation. About to share a bunch of memories here from John Barger, who is a noted attorney and historian from our area. He knows a lot about Johnstown that he's going to share with us today due to the fact that he grew up not too far from downtown Johnstown, because there really used to be a downtown Johnstown. So John's going to share with us a little bit about Johnstown, which is the oldest community in Cumberland County. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
You want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about the start of introduction of Johnstown?
Well, I've done a considerable amount of research. There are a couple of books from a former Johnstown resident by the name of Frida Meisenheimer. I grew up 1.25 miles from downtown Johnstown, and I have some family information to add to that, but that's the source of my information.
Okay, so you're very familiar with downtown Johnstown. What did just tell us what that consisted of when you were young? What was downtown Johnstown?
Well, to be honest, during my lifetime, it's not that much different than it is right now.
Whoa.
Other than Gary Jones' huge barn.
Okay.
But I think I can remember the old store, but I don't have a specific recollection. I think it burned down sometime in the 1960s. Things that you can really attribute to Johnstown that are still there is the old United Brethren Church.
Okay.
It ended as a United Methodist Church when those two churches merged with one another.
Sure.
And about 10 years ago, the church closed and it's sold and owned by a private citizen. But it was built about 1899.
Okay. Still standing.
Still standing. There's still some remnants right over the west edge of the bridge at Johnstown of one or more of the mills that were located there. And I think Mr. Brown has a good picture of them.
Didn't we tour that or see that when we went on the cemetery tour up there?
Well, they're exposed that much more this spring.
Well, yeah, I guess a little more water, huh?
You know, it's easy to see why Johnstown got developed there. They had to come up with a power source to do something. And if you're ever in Johnstown in the spring after a big rain, particularly now, the water comes in torrents down Muddy Creek.
Yeah.
And often gets outside of its banks. I'm sure it's worse now than it was then, since there wasn't land tilled up and more trees and cover crops. Right. But it was something that I think John Tully saw, or maybe a predecessor to him, that hey, we've got a possibility of constructing a mill here.
Mm-hmm. So who were the original inhabitants of Johnstown?
Well, the first person identified with Johnstown is a fellow by the name of John Tully. He came there in about 1827, and he left, I think, about 10 years later. But he constructed a mill right on Muddy Creek, and we believe it to be west of the current bridge at Johnstown.
Okay.
And later he constructed a horse-powered mill, because if you go to Johnstown in the middle of summer, you can see why there wouldn't be enough power to generate to move a mill. So that happened later.
Did he also have a still?
He had a still. I think that was the incentive. As I think I've told people, Johnstown started with a still and ended up with several churches.
Okay, he was repenting a little there.
Okay.
Okay. Now we have Alfred Alexander.
wanna
Was
talk-
also one of the original ones.
I don't know if you want to talk about the location.
Yes, I do. I want to talk about the location of
Okay.
this. Okay.
Johnstown is located 3/4 of a mile south of the Coles-Cumberland County line in Cumberland County. It is exactly 3.25 miles to Lerna from there. A lot of people may not know exactly where it's located. There aren't any signs, so you have to know where you're at. It is east of Trilla, about 2.5 miles, and west of Janesville, about 2.5 miles.
Right in the middle.
And all of those cities are the reasons, in part, why Johnstown died. They got railroads and Johnstown didn't. It's interesting to look at maps of the area and then talk to people who live in this particular area. When it was first developed about 1827, the settlers didn't follow section lines or anything like that in constructing roads. The closest way of getting there was a direct line, and there are pieces of property, particularly in Coles County, that refer to the Charleston to Johnstown Road. And in fact, my brother owns some property where a village called Springville is located. And it came right past there, came through some of the land that we own. In fact, my grandpa Barger apparently knew exactly where it was located. I own some property northwest of there. There's a community right on the railroad between Trilla and Lerna, where the railroad is located, called Folger. And there's remnants of the Johnstown to Folger Road. Then going to the southeast, one of the main heavily traveled routes in Cumberland County in the beginning was between Johnstown and Greenup. And then there was another road that went from Johnstown to Woodbury. And then Woodbury and Greenup were connected. So that's one of the earliest highway patterns in Cumberland County, kind of a triangle. If you want to call it the Bermuda Triangle.
Not nowadays, I call that not the way things are. So really, all roads led to Johnstown at one time.
And if you look at a map today and drive around Johnstown, you'll see that any road in that part of Cottonwood Township all lead to Johnstown.
Seriously. Wonder how many people have really studied that and realized that.
Well, you get anywhere close to Johnstown and you'll get to Johnstown if you want to be there.
If you want to be there. All right. When they're cooking ham and beans and cornbread, I guess a lot of people took that road, didn't they?
Yeah, for several years, ending about 5 to 10 years ago, there used to be a Johnstown celebration. And I think one of the mottos was, all roads lead out of Johnstown, but why would you ever want to leave?
Oh, that's a very nice thought, isn't it? Yeah, that is. How many families live there now, John, just roughly?
10 to 15. If you're talking about Johnstown proper, or where I think it was located. The interesting thing about Johnstown is there's a lot of wooded land that has been developed in recent years, and I wouldn't be surprised if you branch out into some of this wooded acres to the east and to the west and to the south. There may be almost as many people that lived in Johnstown at its heyday, but they're all spread out in the country.
Okay. a little more dispersed now. Okay.
I noticed that 2 or 3 years ago. I actually drove my tractor to Toledo. Going slower, you can recognize how many houses have been built down there. You don't, driving in a car, you don't pay attention to it.
You had a little more time when you were on a tractor, didn't you?
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. The famous Burma Road, I guess you took that.
No, I stay away from the Burma on the tractor.
Do you? Don't want to get everybody mad at you, do you? While you're going down
Well, I
there,
tend to
huh?
go cross country.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, what else would you like to share with us about the original settling of Johnstown and the people that were there?
As I said, John Tully stayed there for about 10 years. He sold the property to a couple fellows by the name of Bob Dixon and Walter Patterson. They then tried to name the town Sheffield. We don't have any idea why. Later, in about 1846, a fellow by the name of Alfred Alexander bought the property. His son was instrumental in laying out streets and platting the village. His name was John, and he's actually the one the village is named after.
Johnstown. Okay. Well, there's a Sheffield, England. Maybe they were from English descent.
Hard to tell.
Hard to tell, yeah.
And the original town had about 12 blocks and a public square, and each block had 8 lots on it.
Each block had 8 lots, okay.
An interesting side note to this is I know of at least 2 plats to the village of Johnstown. There's an original plat. The local title company has a copy of it. However, the original burned down when the courthouse burned down in 1885. Sometime in the last 30 or 40 years, I think the county commissioned a new plat. The new plat, however, doesn't agree with the old plat. So a couple of times I've had to put together a lengthy affidavit by the person in the title company explaining what piece of property that person actually owns.
Is this related to doing your abstract work and all that, so they can
Correct.
have clear title, I guess, you need to know. Yeah.
Sure do.
Yeah. So how many acres is originally, the original settlement of Johnstown?
I couldn't tell you without looking at the plat map itself, but a good guesstimate would be probably 4 or 5 acres.
4 or 5 acres, okay. It says here that in 1884 there was a store and several shops and 2 members of professions. Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, this is coming from Frida Meisenheimer's book.
Yeah, I think she knows a lot.
and she would in turn talk to older people. And I think this is where this information came from. It might be in some document she located. And by professions, I think it meant doctors.
Okay.
Which is an interesting thing in Johnstown. You would not think that a small community like that would have had that many doctors in town at one time.
Had 2 physicians.
Well, at one point or the other, from about 1860 to 1880, there were 4.
My goodness. Well, they had a large rural community, I guess, to attend to. I guess there was enough business to go around. Yeah.
But there was I don't know if you want me to go into that at this point.
I kind of do, because I was thinking about Abraham Lincoln and his ties to the area. Gee, I wonder if they ever wandered over, any of that family, to Johnstown. They might have needed a doctor.
Although Frida's books wandered into Lincoln issues, I don't see anything that I read that suggested a connection with Lincoln and Johnstown.
Okay. Just
Although it's conceivable he could have been there, or particularly his father be there.
yes, Thomas Lincoln, you know, after all. Everyone has to have a doctor, so.
And it wasn't that far away.
Right, As you say, all roads led to Johnstown, so.
It would have been, probably approximately 5 miles to where the Lincoln Log Cabin State Park is located. It's conceivable, I just don't have any evidence of
Right,
it.
sure. Whiskey, and then he had churches, and it says here, Johnstown was really started by whiskey. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, at various times, one of the interesting stories, it's kind of going off on a tangent. They had an active women's Christian temperance union located in Johnstown. My grandma Barger, and Frida Meisenheimer, I know, were members of it.
Of course. Yeah.
They had, and I'll have to look at my notes here, the names because they're not familiar to me. At one time, a Christian Campbellite church. Of course, the United Brethren Church, I already talked about, the building's still there. A Baptist church, and there is a Baptist church in Johnstown now called Hopewell. There's a new church building there. There was a Free Methodist church and a Universalist church.
What is Universalist Church?
I can't answer that question. I know that one of the doctors belonged to it. I think it was a Dr. Shull. But beyond that, I don't know of these. The only two I'm familiar with in my lifetime are the United Brethren Church and the Baptist Church.
Right, okay. Just wondering what the doctrines were for the Universalist Church.
But I can't help you with that one.
Okay, well, we'll just continue to wonder. It's okay. Somebody can Google that when they watch this. They can Google that and figure that one out, what it was back then. Yeah. They still have weddings in the one church, huh?
Occasionally, it's a private citizens own it, and I think they rent it out as a wedding chapel.
Okay, that'd be nice. That'd be nice. Okay, well, let's talk about, if you got churches, you've got schools. Let's hear about the schools, what all was going on with schools.
I can only remember one myself, but according to Frida's book, there were at least 2 others before that. Apparently one was a log cabin out east of Johnstown, about half a mile. And then there were two schools located in downtown Johnstown. I'm not sure where the first one was located, but the second one would be towards the north side of Johnstown. And the reason I remember it, by that time it had closed. I think it was when school consolidation took place. The Cumberland School District had that and closed it. And I think it was around the late 1940s. So I don't remember it actually being used as a school. How it was used, I think it was conveyed to a Johnstown Community Foundation, and they let the local 4-H club have cornbread and bean suppers there. And I remember going to it, and a lot of people there, basically a one-room school type building. And eventually that stopped, and no one was using it. It was falling apart, and Gary Jones and his father took it down.
So it's no longer standing.
It's no longer
It's
there.
part of history.
Nothing
Nothing but a memory now.
No schools in Johnstown anymore.
Okay, all right. Well, let's go back to the doctors here a little bit, and then I have a question for you about all these 4 physicians that they had at one time in this tiny area. Were there any undertakers up there, by the way? Was there a funeral parlor, an undertaker anywhere close, or how did they do this back then?
I don't know the answer to it, and I don't recall the subject being covered in Frida's books. Maybe she didn't want to dwell on that.
Too close to
One
home. Mortality.
One piece of related information I have is I own some property in Coles County, northwest of Johnstown. On that property is a cemetery called
Yes.
Wright Cemetery.
We were there, yes.
And it's about an acre and a half. According to my father, it's completely full. Although you wouldn't gather it from looking at it. You've seen it.
Yes, Lots of blank places in there, isn't there?
Well, they aren't really blank. They had people dying fast with cholera.
Yes.
So that there weren't any tombstones put up. But by far the majority of the people buried in that cemetery are from the Johnstown area.
Okay.
If you study the topography around Johnstown, you've of course got Muddy Creek, a lot of low areas and swampy areas, none of which are good for a cemetery.
Right.
There is a cemetery to the east of Johnstown called Hagen Cemetery. It's considerably, well, it's about the same size, I think, as Wright Cemetery. But and anybody modern day from the Johnstown area, a lot of them are buried in Janesville Cemetery.
Yes. A very well maintained and very pretty cemetery up there. That's
Well,
a
thank
large one. That's a large one, John.
Well, thank you. I'm the president.
Well, okay, John. You want to solicit a donation now?
Well, it's not because of me, it's because of our great caretaker, Shane Clark.
It is a very pretty cemetery. I always notice it when we go by, you know. Pretty full, though. Are you running out of room up there?
Oh, no, we've got a lot of burial sites still.
Okay. Well.
14 and a half acres.
Oh, well, yeah, you're doing really good. Yeah. You're doing really good. Okay, well, let's go back. So these physicians couldn't get these people well, and so they ended up in one of these cemeteries up there. So let's go into a little more depth about these, and I want to talk about trading the medical practices, which is something I have never, ever heard of.
Well, first there was I'll have to look him up, Jonathan Wilson Shaw, grew up in Greenup. After the, let me delve off on him a little bit, so I don't forget about it. I would consider him a hero. He studied medicine prior to the Civil War. He enlisted in the Civil War. He was stationed as a hospital intern in Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and he got captured by the Confederates in Louisiana and was a prisoner of war in 2 prisons, one in Louisiana and one in Texas. And then he came back to Greenup after the Civil War. He apparently knew one of the doctors in Johnstown, Dr. Nathaniel James. Dr. James, I don't know, wanted to move on, but he had a practice established in Johnstown. And Dr. Shaw and Dr. James exchanged real estate and their practices. And Dr. Shaw moved to Johnstown, and Dr. James moved to Greenup.
And we don't know why.
Nobody has said why, but Dr. Shaw stayed there the rest of his life, and he's actually buried in Janesville Cemetery.
Okay.
Dr. James was there at least until about 1870, and then moved to Greenup, and I think he was a pretty prominent citizen of Greenup. And I think you'll recognize those names as being names of families in the Greenup area.
Still to this day. A lot of Shoals, and also in Jasper County. Yes.
There was another doctor, Dr. Bannerman, and in Frida's book there's quite a bit of sketchy information from him, on him. He came from either England or Scotland or Ireland. It's less than clear where, but they said he talked with quite a brogue. Somehow he had lost his family. They'd all passed away, and he moved to the United States. He stayed with a family south of Johnstown by the name of Rowland. Interesting, it's actually a comment about one of my distant relatives. He got put up with him on his diet, and apparently made a comment somewhat along these lines that he can talk and explain the best he can, but he can't create people's brains.
Yeah, it's right here. Can't create them, can he?
And he met an unfortunate death. He actually drowned while fording Mule Creek south of Johnstown.
He drowned.
And I don't have an exact date of death, and I don't know where he is buried.
Well, that was quite a traumatic death there.
To me, one of the most interesting stories was about another doctor in Johnstown, John Morris Croak. His parents were born in the County Cork in Ireland, and they migrated to the Louisville, Kentucky area. He went through school and medical school in Louisville, and apparently shortly prior to the Civil War, he traveled down there to visit with folks, and it soon became apparent that there was a great difference of opinion on Abraham Lincoln.
Really?
That the folks in Louisville weren't favorable to Abraham Lincoln, and Croak decided it's time for him to leave. He came back here. He tried to enlist in the Army, and they wouldn't take him. He apparently was almost blind in one eye and was only 5 feet tall. Apparently, somewhere along the route, they finally accepted him, and towards the end of the war, he did serve as a medic or a doctor in the Union Army.
Okay. Was this over like abolitionist views, or what do you think? Because the problem was why they didn't want him down there in Kentucky, the Lincoln
Well,
connection.
from what I can gather from the story I've read, it must have been about the time of the election. And Croak's friends were not favorable towards Lincoln, because the perception, I think, was he intended on ending slavery.
Right.
And they were in favor of slavery, and them against us type mentality. But interesting part of Dr. Croak is he actually founded another community in Cumberland County before coming to Johnstown.
What was that?
It was called Croak.
Croak, okay. Okay.
And Mr. Brown can tell you more about it, but Croak is located south and west of Toledo. And I don't think too far from what people recognize as the old Bean School corner, south of there. And eventually Croak croaked.
Yes, I got it.
And Dr. Croak then moved to Johnstown and opened up a practice there.
Okay.
And he is in fact buried in Wright Cemetery.
Okay.
One of the things that I remember reading all these stories is how intelligent a man he was, that people had questions, certain physics questions, how to do certain things, and they would come and talk to him about it. And he would go through a logical approach and make a recommendation on how to do something.
kind of interesting. So he may have been very diminutive in size, but he had quite a big impact, didn't he,
Correct.
on the community? Yeah.
And Frida had several stories about some of his ancestors. There's no one in the Croak family that I know of around Johnstown. I'm trying to think. The daughter or granddaughter moved to New Mexico, and they had contact with her during Frida's lifetime.
So, but that family's kind of extinct to the region.
Correct.
Now. Well, let's talk about Frida, since she seems to know everybody, everything, and everywhere. I kind of want to know a little bit more about Frida.
Backing up one thing, Dr. Scholl does have relatives still living in the Johnstown area. In fact, Gary Jones is a great-grandson
Okay.
of Dr. Scholl.
Okay. And that's one you consider to be a hero, right?
Correct.
Survived being a Confederate prisoner, didn't he?
Awful lot of people went into prisons at that time and didn't make it out.
That's right. But he was in Louisiana in prison?
And in Texas.
Just think how that must have been.
During the hot part of the
I
year.
was like, think about mosquitoes, think
Malaria.
about snakes, yeah, think about just what the climate was then. They didn't have any air conditioning, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's go on to Frida then. Let's hear about this lady.
Well,
I hope you have a picture of her somewhere.
we do from her book.
Okay. Well,
Growing up, I will tell you that Frida is one of the two biggest characters that I ever encountered in my life.
whoa. And you're an attorney and you can say she was one of them.
Well, I don't know how to compare all of this, but growing up though, it was Frida and Earl Best. Earl lived in Coles County.
Was near Shelbyville or something. Doesn't he still have family there?
No, just south of Lerna.
Just south of Lerna. Okay. Let's hear about that.
Earl was a first cousin of my dad and uncle, and Frida is a cousin as well. The interesting part to me is I never knew my grandpa Barger. His name was James Emil Barger. He would have been approximately a second or third cousin of Frida. She would come and visit with him. By that time, he was blind. He'd had a couple of sawmill accidents, and but he had a tremendous memory. So a lot of these stories in her book came from him. And it's one of the things that I thought was interesting. He recounted stories that his father, who was James Washington Barger, told him as he migrated from around Natural Bridge, Virginia, eventually to Cumberland County.
That is, yes.
And one of them is particularly interesting. The Barger family migrated to that area because there are a lot of trees. They were in the sawmill business. My brother and I are the first generation of the Barger family in Illinois not to own a sawmill. And going along with that, a lot of land was cleared in the Johnstown area. And I guess he saw an opportunity. He ordered some sort of special plow from Cincinnati, Ohio, that he referred to as the steel plow. And he had oxen, and he would pull this plow with oxen and hire out the people to plow up their sod. And some of the stories were interesting to the extent of plowing some acreage, and a lot of it was right around Johnstown because his wife and my great-grandmother grew up in Johnstown. And he would talk about plowing through buffalo wallows.
Whoa. Okay.
And Frida would kind of got off on a tangent on that thing, whether we had buffalo in Johnstown. I suspect at some point there may have been, but I think what he was probably referring to is the fact a lot of that soil up there are clay knobs and banks. And if you plow into that with a tractor or whatever, they pull very hard. So that's probably why he resorted to a steel plow as opposed to an iron one. And also pulled it with oxen. And then they talked about encountering all the snakes and plowing all this prairie.
Charming.
And apparently at that time there were actually rattlesnakes
We
in the
still
area.
have timber rattlers, do we?
Not in this immediate area. I understand south of here there are in different areas, but I haven't seen or heard any stories of anything in just this immediate vicinity, Coles or Cumberland County.
But rattlesnakes, huh?
Mhm.
He was dealing with that.
And so those sort of stories were very interesting to me. And he actually told about the migration from around Natural Bridge, Virginia to Champaign County, Ohio to Cumberland County. And to me it's amazing to read that. But Frida did a great service to people. Sometimes it's hard to read what she said. Frida, if you knew her, was quite an excitable person. She could get up in the air and excited, and part of that led to her being able to convince the highway department to put a new bridge in at Johnstown. She ran almost a one-person campaign to get a new bridge at Johnstown. I think the old one was closed, and sometime in the late 60s, early 70s, it was unsafe. Frida went around and had people sign petitions, and then when they opened the new bridge, they even had WCIA come down
Whoa,
and video it. Of course, she was front and center.
notoriety, huh?
But she was not hesitant to speak her mind.
So she made a good member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, didn't she?
Well,
What do you think, John? You think she did a good job there?
there was another aspect to Frida.
Okay, let's hear.
Around Christmas time, she would make this drink called Cherry Bounce.
I saw
And I
that.
understand that Cherry Bounce had her own cherries she raised, plus bourbon.
There we go.
There was quite a contradiction there.
I see that.
Of giving people Cherry Bounce and being a member of the WCTU. But apparently she didn't see the conflict. Back at that time, there was a television show called The Waltons.
Yeah, sure.
And I can't remember the name of the two sisters that kept making this thing they called the recipe,
Okay.
which was alcohol in the midst of Prohibition. And they acted as though it was entirely medicinal, and I think Frida's view of that would probably be close to the same.
Close to that. Well, whatever works for Frida, we want it to be right for her.
One of the funniest things about Frida, and you'll see it in the book, it's her second book, she had a sign that she kept along the road. She actually lived in the house that Theron and Peggy Kuhn live in right now,
Oh, okay.
on the south side of Johnstown.
Uh-huh.
And on that wooden sign she painted herself, it said, "No hunting, don't even ask." And then in her second book, she took a picture of it.
Good.
And it's in her
Good.
book, and then she referred to it as the most feared sign in Cumberland County.
So she held all of them at bay, didn't she? Don't guess she had to worry about any poachers, maybe.
No, my brother-in-law tells the story. He was a UPS route driver back in the days that she was living in the house, and she apparently stored her apples by digging a hole in the ground and burying them.
Now, Brent knew this lady?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right,
She would have died in the 1980s, and I
okay,
can't tell you the exact time.
okay.
But he delivered something to the house, and she gave him a apple, and she explained she had it buried in the ground. I don't think he ate it.
Let's say, was he able to eat this or not?
He didn't try.
Scared him off.
I have never heard of anybody else bearing fruit.
Neither. No, I wouldn't think that would work
Mm-hmm.
at all. I mean, you hear about fruit sellers,
Mhm.
but not buried in the ground exactly.
Frida was a kind of a slight build, real leathery type skin, and always wore what I call flip-flops or thongs, even in wintertime.
Did she ever marry?
Oh yeah, she was married. Her husband's name was Glenn, but you rarely saw Glenn. He pretty much stayed to himself after he retired, and she always referred to him as Mousy.
She called her husband
Mousy, yeah.
My, how charming.
Well, it works with that last name, Meisenheimer.
Mousy Meisenheimer, yeah. It's got a good ring to it, doesn't it? Oh my, what was his profession, I wonder?
I think a plumber and steam fitter, but I don't know. As long as I knew him, he was retired.
Did she work away from the home, or was she
No.
strictly their children?
She had at least one daughter, and I never knew the children very well. They were gone by that time, and really didn't encounter them. Her daughter, after Frida died, moved into the house, and she has passed away too.
I see.
So I really don't know what's happened with the rest of the family.
As far as descendants go, you don't know if anybody took after Frida, do you?
Well, nobody could match Frida.
Kind of sounds that way after that apple story, yeah, for sure.
And how we encountered her a good deal, she always had sheep.
Oh,
And she would want us to come down. My dad and uncle had a custom hay baling business. And her land was right along Muddy Creek. I don't think she ever fertilized it. So there wasn't a whole lot of hay out there when we'd go bale it. It was so rough. But the ultimate was her barn. I avoided at all costs getting in the hay mow because I figured I would be on the ground. Because some of the hay mow you're about walking on imagination.
whoa, she didn't believe in making repairs, huh?
She didn't, and Mousy didn't either.
Okay, Mousy may not have been able to, huh?
You didn't see him much.
Wonder why.
The other thing that's interesting is she had lots and lots of flowers around the place, and Theron is my wife's uncle, and he tells me they keep finding more flowers and trees that she had planted all the way down to Muddy Creek.
My goodness,
Mm-hmm.
she was an avid horticulturalist, wasn't she?
And she told some wild stories about going different places, but she did the area a great service in writing those books.
I wonder how she ever got started on that, John. What do you think prompted her to pursue that?
Well, times were different back then. You didn't necessarily entertain yourself by watching TV. You went and visited people, and she had a lot of relatives.
Oh, okay. Had a lot of stories to tell then that were shared.
And I assume what happened is she just started writing them down. She would go visit with somebody and then wrote notes down. But if you read some of it, some of her stories are hard to read because it isn't necessarily a narrative telling you what somebody said, but she would also get involved in the story too.
She has an interpretation?
Correct.
Okay. And you're not sure whether it's a right or wrong interpretation, huh?
Well, and some of her stories talking to my grandpa Barger were quite interesting. And even though I didn't know him, I knew my dad and uncle and my grandma Barger, and none of them got very excited at any point. So it would just be that he was kind of the antithesis of Frida.
Okay. He was low key and she was pretty hyped up. Huh?
Hyped up.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I always found to be interesting with Frida is she was a coupon clipper before that was even
Noted that.
popular.
Uh-huh.
She would order coupons for all of her neighbors and then go around and pick up their coupons.
So she could cash them in?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why I say, honestly, in growing up until I was 18 or 20, she was one of the greatest characters in the area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I guess she probably never saw a stranger either, huh?
No, she talked to anyone.
Okay. Did she have any political affiliations?
What I'm gathering, particularly with the stories of my grandpa Barger was a Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
And she was very pro-Lincoln, so I assume she was a Republican.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And he or she, it's hard to tell in these stories, commented that their political persuasions were not the same.
uh-huh. Okay. Okay. Well, of course, the Lincoln Republican Party then versus now is an entirely different operation.
Mhm.
Well, politics in general is entirely
Correct.
different, isn't it? Was there anything else you'd like to share about the community, John? Besides, this is a very good closing paragraph you did today on what Johnstown is like today, because we can all still go visit Johnstown if we choose to, because it's there.
Correct. The things you might look for if you want to visit the area: Wright Cemetery, Hagen Cemetery. You'll see where a lot of the folks that lived in the Johnstown area are buried. Something that is real neat to look at, and particularly this year, with all the erosion around the bridge, there's still some timbers that I think were identified with the mill, one of the mills at Johnstown, and the old United Brethren Church.
Mm-hmm.
Virtually everything else is gone.
Okay. Well, I think it's fascinating that the community is still there and still doing business.
Well, to me, what's interesting is to have had a community that significant that you really can't even find unless you know where you're at today.
But all roads lead there. We'll just stick with
All
it.
roads lead to
As long as
Johnstown.
we stick with it,
Correct.
we're going to end up there. That's good to know. Well, I always like to ask, is there anything about that you think about today and how we are today that you would like to see changed or maybe revert back to how it used to be? Are there any changes in our world or society or anything? You have any thoughts on that?
Oh, everything is faster paced today,
Yes. it
even
is.
than when I was growing up. People don't talk to one another as much. They communicate on Facebook or text messages, occasionally phone calls. And growing up, what I remember is people actually came and visited.
Mhm.
And one of the people that always come and visit is Frida Meisenheimer.
I bet so. Did you boys hang around when Frida was there just to hear what she was going to say?
Unfortunately not. We tried to avoid Frida
Well,
at that time because she kind of went off on tangents, but you get a little bit older and you wish you would have listened more.
yes. I think everyone has that regret.
I was talking to Gary Jones and telling him about his great-grandfather, Dr. Shaw, and his grandmother was one of the last school teachers at Johnstown, and his daughter. And when Gary was young, his grandmother would try to tell him all sorts of things, and Gary said, I didn't want to listen then.
And now he wants to know.
And he didn't know half the information that I told him.
My goodness. Well, he was glad to get to talk to you then, wasn't he? Yeah.
And we at Janesville Cemetery, we're coming out with a new book about people buried in the cemetery, and there's going to be a segment on Dr. Shaw.
Okay. That'll be well received, I'm sure. Well, John, I want to thank you for sharing your Johnstown stories with us today. It's been a really nice interview and something that's preserved for history now, and we appreciate your helping us with our person, places, and things, stories for the Cumberland County Historical Society. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.